The earlier non-figural mosaic pavements from the Episcopal Basilica of Philippopolis. The article aims to show the development of the mosaic art in Philippopolis on the example of the non-figural mosaics of the Episcopal Basilica of Philippopolis in Thracia, now Plovdiv in Bulgaria, from the second quarter of the 4th century till Marcian in the middle beginning of the second half of the 5th century. The referred mosaics belong mainly to the first building period, with its 3 phases, and only the mosaic with the peacock dates from the second building period. The technique opus signinum reappears in late antiquity in several cities of Thracia, mainly in 3 monuments from Philippopolis and 2 in Serdica and its environments. The main proof can be grasped from the stratigraphy of the 3 main mosaic levels of the Episcopal Basilica in Plovdiv. The first one is signinum. It is obvious that the signinum was not the statumen, but a real mosaic surface, since the next layer in opus tessellatum does not lay immediately on the signinum, but on an additional mortar layer. That's why, for a certain period, the signinum was used as a real floor covering all the surface of the basilica. The example of the Episcopal Basilica in Philippopolis reveals that the revival of the opus signinum was caused by economic reasons. A coin of Licinus was found during the conservation work, placed inside the concave surface of the tegula from the pagan sanctuary under the signinum. The coin looks as occasional find dropped in the debris of the pagan temple built on the same place in Roman times. The way the coin has been laid is non-typical for the coins of the foundation votive. This fact means that the basilica in Plovdiv can be dated either during the time of the coin or rather after its minting as terminus post quem. The earliest mosaic in signinum has been replaced by the second mosaic level, already in tessellatum, probably at the very end of Constantine I, or of ruling of his sons. At the beginning, the new pavement has been laid only in the nave. Its main role in the liturgy determined the better decoration and the more effective and expensive mosaic technique, while both aisles remained covered for a certain period only with signinum, again because of the financial reasons. Now the Episcopal Basilica was covered with the typical for the early Constantinian time schemes with pseudo-emblems and conventional motifs. The date of the tessellatum in the nave of the Episcopal Basilica in Plovdiv can be determined not only by the ground of the presenting, but also on the lacking stylistic features of the further developing stylistic phases of the Constantinian period, as terminus ante quem. Obviously, the second floor of the Episcopal Basilica of Plovdiv has been laid before the middle of the 4th century because of the unity of the composition, the supposed pseudo-emblems, and the modest repertoire and palette. If the basilica has been built and decorated with signinum in the 20s, 30s, the mosaic of the naos in tessellatum could be prepared in the 30s, 40s. However, it was very modest and did not answer the Magnificent Basilica. It should be paid special attention to the fact that the mosaics of the Episcopal Basilica of Philippopolis up to the second half of the 5th century have been used tesserae, namely of different stones and not smalti. The lack of glass tesserae in the pavements of the earlier tessellata mosaic levels in Philippopolis and Partikopolis also points to the work of a very experienced metropolitan mosaicist at the head of the mosaic workshops. Nevertheless, later, from the middle end of the 5th century in Philippopolis, as well as Partikopolis and Nicopolis ad Nestum, the smalti have been introduced. At the present state of research, the explanation can be twofold. There happened some changes in the ownership of the quarries or the places with important color stones, other than with white marble, have been already exhausted. Additionally, at that time, the role of the smalti technique became dominant, together with the easier way of supplying with glass half manufacture. The artisans of the first and the next tesselatum mosaics, second and third mosaic layers, also adhere to such a choice of very big sized tesserae up to the middle of 5th century, every time submitting to the scale of the basilica. The big size motifs and the big dimensions of each tessera were in accordance to the scale of the basilica and the need of quick mosaic laying. It is logical to suppose that these technological details in the first huge basilicas in the Balkans had one and the same prototype in the earliest pavement mosaics of Rome and Constantinople, unfortunately not preserved. Four mosaic styles After the first Opus Tessellatum, the next mosaics in the Episcopal Basilica of the middle of the 5th century were not figural, except some basic early Christian symbols, such as the fountain of life, the tree of life, the trellised vine, the catharos, and the chalice, with wine as symbols of the Eucharist, the peacock as symbol of the everlasting life after death of the true Christian, the paradise with its meadows, flowers, trees, and peaceful animals and birds, the chrismon and the fish as symbols of Christ, the Last Supper and the resurrection, the flora and fauna of earth and ocean created by God, etc. The reasons for the disappearing of the figural images can be explained by the avoiding of pagan representations, the special attitude of the Arianism, the monophysists, and other heresies towards the images, as well as the liturgical demands of united surface and space. The newly created enormous early Christian basilicas, monumental official palaces, and private residences had very long and vast floors which could be easier and more quickly laid, and this would cost less if covered namely with geometric ornamental compositions than with figural ones. And it should be also added that the Christian liturgy needed a new way of movement and rhythm in the interior created by the architectural access, entrances, and liturgical furniture. However, concerning concretely the mosaics in the territory of Eastern Illyricum, Moesia, Thracia, and Dacia Mediterranea, the figural representations disappeared totally after Julian and the Valentinians and have been gradually introduced again only from the period of late Theodosius first onwards, naturally and presumably under the influence of the changes in Rome and Constantinople. Four mosaic styles after Constantine I can be observed in the Episcopal Basilica in Plovdiv in the first and at the beginning of the second building period. Only in the fourth one with the peacock, the figural representations of the significant importance. The rest ones are either entirely non-figural or with new early Christian symbol and floral motifs. They refer to the period of the disappearing in 4th century and the reappearing of the figural images in 5th century. The earliest one is the panel found in the south portico of the court. It may be called the style of the thick white outlines, although some of the latter and rather in fine ivory or rather beige nuance. The composition should be read in the direction west-east alongside the portico. The scheme is orthogonal grid of octagons with concave sides in the center, 4 circles at the corners of the grid, and 4 splinters between each pair of circles. An enlargement at the west end of the corner contains a partly preserved pseudo-emblem a big dotted yellow figural representation on the background of brushes and branches. The fillings of the octagons in the rainbow style are in brown, blue, and rarer in red and yellow, chessboard pattern and serrated figures, either of three-dimensional effect of the rosette, or a big cross, or a rosette of the quatrefoil, or the Solomon's knot. The circles contain inscribed crosses of two types. Every third filling in the most northern preserved axis west-east contains a cantorus with red wine facing the beholder entering the court from the west. White symmetrical hedera leaves on a dark brown background are hanging down from both its sides. At the present moment, the panel of this style from Philippopolis is the earliest one found in Bulgaria and the starting point of the study. The main problem is its dating, 4th or 5th century. In my opinion, this panel, in the style of the thick white outlines, is slightly preceding and then for shortly synchronous to the very early phases of the puristic and the geometric styles. The second style in the Episcopal Basilica of Plovdiv represents the final phase of development of the puristic style. It is also a newly created style in the 4th century, and its first appearing is related to the early period of Theodosius I, probably around 381-383, supposedly in Constantinople. The level of this artistic treatment, the novelties introduced, and the topography of its spread in the hinterland of Constantinople, Philippopolis, Augusta Traiana, Kabyle, Nicopolis, Nestum, and the Black Sea littoral Markianopolis, give enough ground to such a presumption. These were cities not only situated closely to the capital, but also with easy reach by the land of the main road via Diagonalis or by ship to the port of Odessos. In the later phase of development of the puristic style in the south aisle of the Episcopal Basilica of Plovdiv, from the end of 4th, beginning of 5th century, the palette changes from bright to more refined in several nuances of brown, mainly light and dark, followed by the ones in blue, green, and red. Other newly introduced elements, already on a great scale, are the ones in the rainbow style and the fillings of every free geometric unit. Most probably the initial puristic style from the beginning of the 80s and its final metamorphosis from the end of the 4th century have been created in the workshops of Constantinople. From there, the new metropolitan puristic style has been spread and introduced in the provincial basilicas in the Diocese of Thracia because of its splendid artistic qualities, the geographic nearness of the cities to Constantinople, and the strong impact of the religious cultural politics on the art of the mosaic decoration during the rule of the Theodosian dynasty. The third new style of the Episcopal Basilica of Plovdiv is represented by the big composition in the central and eastern part of the south aisle. The scheme is among the most complex one and in the so-called geometric rainbow style. 3 very big octagons are making the central axis of the south aisle, in which of them a big circle is placed with a different decoration. Cantorus, peltier, loops, fillers, big and small circles, chorus, chessboard and rainbow motifs, rosettes, lozenges and cables. The circle and the loops are very big, even rude in comparison to the gracious and fine ornamental fillers, and treated as to achieve a 3-dimensional effect. The surface around the 3 octagons is occupied by tightly attached to each other and to the octagon squares, triangles, lozenges, and smaller circles. They and decoration inside them are arranged symmetric to the main axis. All the lozenges are decorated either with the same style, with a three-dimensional effect of adjacent parallelograms in two different colors, reminding chevrons, or with the motif of unusually refined silver plate. Some other motifs remind the rude folklore textile of the type of sackcloth from ancient times to our days. Among the rare motifs is the marvelous unitary rosette of four lilies. The most interesting and met of the first time in Philippopolis are the squares with two variants of orthogonal pattern imitating the wooden intarsia, made of dark and light brown square pieces, or in the form of double axe, mainly with three-dimensional effect. The most important representation is placed in a square under a second octagon, right in the middle axis of the south aisle, surrounded by the ends of the four-pointed saltire star. Two of the points are in the rainbow style. In the square, a tabula ansata is represented, all in red color, in contrast to the brown, blue, green palette of the whole mosaic composition. The tabula is placed on a long, heavy column in white in the middle and two nuances of blue at both ends to achieve the three-dimensional effect. The column is flanked by two very elegant vessels, the entirely preserved one from the right side filled with red wine. The second, only partly preserved vessel is shown with bigger proportions. Such representations are connected with the liturgy, both in the Judaism and the early Christianity. The tabula contains a mosaic inscription with the word bishop, together with the name only partly preserved. This is the usual building inscription demonstrating the power and the responsibilities of the bishop during whose time the mosaic floor has been laid. The way the inscription is shown in the middle of the south aisle is tabula ansata, supported by a column, reminds the grandiloquent inscription at the base of the obelisk of Theodosius I in Constantinople and other solemn official sculptural and mosaic inscriptions of the time of Arcadius, who in fact was compelled of the erecting of these official monuments begun by his father Theodosius I. The repertory of the treatment of the schemes and separate motifs are quite different from the other mosaics of Philippopolis. Combined with the panel with inscription, the liturgical vessels and the column supporting the tabula ansata, the pavement has obtained a solemn metropolitan essence. In the Episcopal Basilica of Philippopolis, the mosaics in both style, purist and geometric rainbow ones, are united very successfully by mutual borders, similar palette, because the stone tesserae come from one and the same quarry, proved by the laboratory petrographic analysis, and some identical compartments and motifs. The fillings in the rainbow style, the floral ones and the textile ones, the kilosh, other than the imitation of wooden intarsia. Another reason for uniting the both panels in the south aisle, relating to two different styles, was the tremendous surface to be covered. It was a difficult task to lay quickly with mosaics such a huge basilica with one and the same scheme by one and the same workshop. More adequate tactics has been chosen to invite two or more workshops to work on separate panels and finish in shorter period the covering of all surfaces. Finally, at the very end of the Theodosian period, or more probably during the time of Marcian, the new fourth mosaic style appeared in the Episcopal Basilica in Plovdiv. It is demonstrated by the two partly non-figural, partly figural composition, flanking the central one with a magnificent peacock surrounded by many other birds, liturgical vessels, and rosebuds. This space is very special. The fourth eastern portico of the court is lacking, also lacking the usual western wall of the narthex. In these circumstances, the palace is playing the role of the narthex and thus shortening the great longitude of the whole complex of the basilica with atrium. The proper solution is also known from several basilicas in Thracia and Greece. The dating of the panel with the peacock is important for the time of its flanking panels as well. This type of scheme is repeating the one with the Episcopal mosaic inscription in fourth aisle. Also, many compositions in the rainbow style from Syria and separate fillers from Greece and Bulgaria. The central shield with its golden ground around the peacock is representing a golden cabochon of a jewel, additionally adorned on the periphery by green emeralds surrounded by circles of white pearls and red granites. This is the beginning of the new bejeweled style, which becomes dominant by the second quarter of the 5th century until Justinianic and post-Justinianic period in the 6th century. The new style is reflected in the richest palette of the central bird and the surrounding ones, the rosebuds and the liturgical vessels. In the figural part of the composition, the classicizing trend is featuring, however, with an increase of formality, stronger decorativeness, and also with much longer heaviness and materiality, typical also for the portrait sculpture of the late Theodosian period and that of Marcian. To this composition from the north has been added the one with very modestly treated scales, also with the same purpose to underline the liturgical and symbolical meaning of the central composition with the peacock. All these conservations prove that first the Constantinian period, some workshops have worked in Philippopolis with stylistic and technological features general for the late Roman Empire. In the second half of the 4th century, and particularly during the so-called Theodosian Renaissance, until the beginning of the second half of the 5th century, Philippopolis has played an important role in Thracia and Moesia in the development of the early Christian architecture, liturgy, and mosaic decoration by accepting the influences mainly from Constantinople and the Greek East. Its non-figural mosaics are very precious evidence for the not preserved or still not found mosaics of the Constantinople.